welcoming Dr. Peter Mansoor. He is the General Raymond E. Mason Jr. Chair of Military History at The Ohio State University and a frequent commentator in the media on national security affairs. He assumed his academic position in September 2008 after a 26-year career in the U.S. Army that culminated in his service as the executive officer to General David Petraeus, commanding general of Multinational Force Iraq, during the surge of U.S. forces in 2007 and 2008. A 1982 distinguished graduate of the United States Military Academy, Colonel Mansoor commanded the 1st Brigade, 1st Armored Division from 2003 to 2005, including 13 months of combat in Iraq. After relinquishing command, Colonel Mansoor resided at the Council on Foreign Relations as a senior military fellow and served as the founding director of the U.S. Army Marine Corps Counterinsurgency Center. Dr. Mansoor is the author of the GI Offensive in Europe, The Triumph of American Infantry Divisions, 1941 to 1945. Winner of the Society for Military History Distinguished Book Award, Baghdad at Sunrise, A Brigade Commander's War in Iraq, and Surge, My Journey with General David Petraeus and the Remaking of the Iraq War. Welcome.
Thank you for that overly long introduction. I need to send you the short version. It's great to be back. I remember the last time was in Confluence Park. This is a much more intimate surroundings, but I've never been to this area of Columbus, so there you go. It's a first. Italian Village, right? Yep. So nice. All right. I'm going to talk to you for about 20 minutes about Ukraine. And I'm going to start with a little bit of the history and the background, why Vladimir Putin is doing what he's doing, and then talk a little bit about how the war is going. Ukraine is a large, populous country, 233,000 square miles, 43 million people. If superimposed on a map of the United States, it would stretch from New York to Chicago. So this is what Putin has taken on, basically conquering the eastern half of the United States, against very determined opposition, I might add. There is a shared history here between Russia and Ukraine. They both trace their routes to the Kievan Rus, which is a medieval entity, but from that comes the names of both Russia and Belarus today. The Kievan Rus ruled the area from the 10th century until its extinction by the Mongols in the invasion from the east in the mid-13th century. This was a superpower of its day, larger than the Byzantine Empire, which you can see was to its south. And so Putin and the Ukrainians and the Belarusians, they all believe that they're that this is their founding state, if you will, and that they're worthy of being the modern entity. So in Putin's view, Ukraine has always been an inseparable partner of the Russian Empire, overlooking all sorts of other political entities that have ruled over modern-day Ukrainian lands in the interim, including the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Republic of Genoa, the Crimean Khanate, the Cossack Hetmanate, and the Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian empires. And the Ukrainians themselves do not consider themselves Russians, and this is a really important point. Soviet policies precipitated a great famine in 1932-33 that killed millions of Ukrainians as Stalin basically took all the grain to feed the people in the cities and left rural Ukrainians to starve. The Germans were even able to raise a division of Ukrainian troops in World War II to fight with them against the Red Army. In Putin's view, the dissolution of the Soviet Union was, in his words, the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, a genuine tragedy that left millions of ethnic Russians outside of Russian territory. This is a real stretch given the geopolitical catastrophes of the First and Second World Wars, which he conveniently elides. But he believes that Russia needs to dominate the states on its border, what he calls the near abroad, the states that used to be, in many cases, Soviet socialist republics, part of the Soviet Union. Ukraine gave up about 1,900 of its nuclear weapons in 1994 following the dissolution of the Soviet Union. It would have been one of the great nuclear powers of today had it not done so. And in return, it got, in Neville Chamberlain's words, a scrap of paper. The Budapest Memorandum, signed by the United States, Russia, and Great Britain, to respect the independence and sovereignty and existing borders of Ukraine and to refrain from the threat or use of force against that country. So Putin has basically torn up this memorandum with his invasion. And this is a real tragedy, because what it tells other nations is if you have nuclear weapons, do not give them up, and if you don't have them, you better get them, because it's the only thing that's going to ensure your safety and your sovereignty. We are part of the problem, because we helped depose Muammar Gaddafi in Libya after he gave up his nuclear program. So right now, the record of states who voluntarily give up their nuclear weapons or their nuclear programs and then being invaded is 100%, Libya and Ukraine. So don't expect it to happen again, at least not voluntarily. In other words, there's no way North Korea will give up its nuclear weapons, and Iran is likely to try to get them. Several rounds of NATO enlargement have left Western military forces on Russia's doorstep. Literally, in the case of the Baltic states, here, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, and Georgia and Ukraine have both publicly expressed a desire to join the alliance, which has an open door policy. If you want in, NATO will consider your application. Well, let's go back one. So you can see here Georgia and Ukraine would extend NATO even further towards Moscow, and it's Ukraine which Putin really is concerned about. It's like I said, large populace. It's a dagger pointed at the heart of Russia, in his view. So to forestall further expansion of NATO, Putin invaded Georgia in 2008 and fomented a conflict in the Donbass region of Ukraine, the southeastern part of Ukraine, in 2014. And what this would do is create frozen conflicts. You would have an uncertain state of war, not war, sort of the hybrid gray zone warfare you might have heard about. And that would preclude these states from joining NATO, because NATO has never accepted a member that had outstanding border disputes. So Romania, after the Cold War, wanted to become part of NATO, and it had an outstanding border dispute with Hungary, and they had to resolve that before NATO took either one of them into the alliance. So really, Putin had what he wanted here. There was no way that NATO or Georgia were going to become part of NATO in this kind of situation. There we go, our hero, Vladimir Putin, and all of his friends. His major demand for backing down from a war of his own creation is a subservient Ukraine under his control and a written pledge by NATO not to expand further into Eastern Europe. Such a pledge would allow Putin to achieve his goal of fashioning a pliable and friendly Ukraine, which would be a junior partner to Moscow and supportive of its foreign policy. What Putin really wants is a new security architecture for Europe, one that is not dominated by NATO, and takes into account Russia's historical need for a large buffer zone to the west, given that it's been invaded in 1812 by Napoleon, in 1914 by the Germans and Austro-Hungarians, and in 1941 by the Germans again. The latter conflict resulting in the deaths of more than 20 million Russians. So this is real stuff. We should acknowledge Russia's historic need for buffer space. However, Putin is doing it in a way that is absolutely against the law of the civilized world. In short, Putin wants to make Russia great again. By the way, the reason he's at this long table, he's deathly afraid of being assassinated. And one of the way he assassinates people is through chemicals, little vials of radioactive substance or chemicals, whatever. You get close to someone and you pop open the lid and they breathe it in. So that's why he's not afraid of COVID here. He's afraid of being killed by one of these substances. So Putin decided that he wasn't getting what he wanted through negotiations. He was disheartened by the election of Joe Biden as president. He believed if Trump had a second term, the United States would have pulled out of NATO, and that would have weakened NATO, and he would have been able to get what he wanted in terms of Ukraine at the negotiating table. But because that didn't happen, and Biden's said America's back, we're going to strengthen NATO, Putin decided, he's now 70 years old, if he was going to achieve this dream of his, he was going to have to do it by force of arms. But he ignored the realities of the situation into which he plunged Russia. There's a couple of famous military philosophers that if you're a military historian, you have to quote. It's obligatory, One is Sun Tzu, who's a ancient Chinese military philosopher. And he wrote that if you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. If you know yourself but not the enemy, for every victory gained, you will also suffer a defeat. If you know neither the enemy nor yourself, you will succumb in every battle. Putin didn't know himself or Russian forces. He was misinformed about the quality of his own troops, and he seriously underestimated his enemy and the potential for Ukrainian resistance. The reason that the Russian army was on that 40-mile-long column heading towards Kiev is they didn't think that the Ukrainians would resist. They could just conduct a road march from the Belarusian border down to Kyiv. Obviously, that didn't happen. All right, so the second ancient, or not ancient, but medieval in this case, or early modern, let's call him, military philosopher is Karl von Clausewitz, who was a Prussian. And he wrote in On War, his masterpiece, the most far-reaching act of judgment that the statesman and commander have to make is to establish the kind of war on which they are embarking, neither mistaking it for nor trying to turn it into something that is alien to its nature. Putin expected a quick war of liberation. Instead, what he got was a lengthy war of attrition against a fired-up population that hates him. And that has surprised him. And we can question not his hold on reality, but who is advising him these days, because he has pretty much isolated himself. Go back to that table, right? Astonishingly, as if they had no military experience in the area, the Russians attacked in the middle of what they call the Rasputitsa, the mud period. Vehicles really cannot maneuver off the roads for a couple months in the spring and a couple months in the fall, and the spring has moved back as climate change has reduced the winter time. So even in February, the ground was too soft for mechanized maneuver. And again, another reason you have these long columns of armored vehicles stuck on the paved roads, because they can't maneuver off the roads. And when they do, the Ukrainian farmers and the tractors tow the tanks away and add them to the Ukrainian arsenal. The Russian military has also proven itself inept. It has failed in the three basics of modern armored warfare. It has not gained and maintained air superiority. It can't combine arms and services on the battlefield, so infantry, armor, artillery, engineers, and so forth working together. And it can't keep its forces supplied. Other than that, it's doing great. And it completely ignored what would happen if it tried to take Kyiv. I think it finally got a taste of it and decided to withdraw. But this would be a battle. Kyiv is about the same population as Stalingrad in World War II. And the battle would have been about that fierce as well. And the Germans, after sacrificing just about the entire Sixth Army in the endeavor, still didn't take all of Stalingrad. About 10% of it remained in Soviet hands before the Soviets counterattacked and surrounded the Sixth Army and destroyed it. And this was going to be the Russian army fate in the battle for Kyiv. Instead, we have a microcosm of this at Mariupol, which the Russians probably will take later this. What day is it? Yeah, later this week. The Ukrainians are down to basically one factory, a steel plant that they're still holding on to. It kind of reminds you, for those who've read about the Battle of Stalingrad, about the tractor factory and the grain silos that were fought over by the Red Army so fiercely. But except this time it's the Ukrainians who are the good guys. So there was no way that the Russians were going to be able to take Kyiv. The complete subjugation of Ukraine is simply beyond the Russian army's means. I had, a little bit of experience in trying to occupy a country. And during the surge in Iraq, we had 600,000 security forces. We had 180,000 coalition troops, 320,000 Iraqi army and police, and about 100,000 so-called Sons of Iraq, local militia. So 600,000 who were securing a country of 28 million. So that was about one security person for every 50 Iraqis. And that was just enough to secure Iraq and make the surge a success. And that was with an Iraqi population of which only about 20% or so opposed us. The other 80% either supported us or were neutral. If you look at Ukraine now, the Russians invaded with 200,000, so only a third of the number we had in Iraq. And they were going up against 43 million people, 87% of whom hate their guts. So there was little chance that the Russians were going to be able to occupy all of Ukraine. Even if they did occupy it, they would have faced a guerrilla resistance, the likes of which we haven't seen since World War II, or maybe the Vietnam War. The Russians, at this point, may take a page from their playbook in Syria and just simply pound Ukrainian cities into dust and try to make life so miserable for the Ukrainian people that they will convince their government to make peace. I don't think this will work. The Ukrainians have been energized. If Putin didn't think they were a nation before the invasion, his invasion certainly created a nation. And they were very much a nation before. So he simply, I don't think, can create enough pain to force Ukrainian surrender. The Russians are now reorienting the forces to the south. You can see here how this area up here has been cleared out, the Ukrainian counterattacks. And now you've got the Russians down here. Mariupol is being fought over. And what everyone expects is they're going to attack from the north and the south to take this area right in here. That would give them the Donbass region and a land bridge from that Donbass region to Crimea. And then they'll have at least a limited victory, and they can hopefully have the Ukrainians agree to Russian control. But this is where I think this is going to be a very long war indeed, because there's no way the Ukrainians are going to cede that much territory to the Russians. It's just not going to happen. And so the Ukrainians will fight on, armed by the West, and we should arm them increasingly with tanks and artillery and aircraft, and allow them to counterattack and retake their homeland and force Putin's surrender, or at least his backing off of his goals. Failure to do this would basically tell any country that has nuclear weapons, that, say China, that it could launch a war against, a place like Taiwan, and not be countered because of the threat of nuclear retaliation against anyone who would intervene. Putin simply cannot win this war, because to do so would be disastrous for the international system as we know it today. And as you've all seen, the Moskva, the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet, was sunk by anti-ship cruise missiles produced in Ukraine, I might add, the Neptune anti-ship cruise missiles, which are actually pretty old technology. They're Russian in design, and they're kind of 1980s technology, but they worked. And the way that happened, by the way, is on the lower right. You can see the picture. Is the Ukrainians flew a drone over the ship to focus its defenses up, and then the cruise missiles came in, skimming the waves, and hit it from the side. So Putin wanted to make Russia great again. Instead, he has made NATO essential again. Everyone wants in. Ukrainians want in, Georgians want in, Finns want in, Sweden wants in, because now they see the purpose of NATO, to keep the West free and at peace. Putin is diplomatically isolated. He has been made into an international pariah. Dishearteningly, about 35 states failed to sign the sanctions against Russia. So he isn't completely isolated, but he doesn't have a lot of friends. Even the Germans are rearming. And, for someone to create a situation where the very pacifistic Germans are now considering rearming, that's a real coup. The Germans also canceled the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which runs through the Baltic Sea, that would give or send Russian gas to Germany and bypass the pipeline networks that run through Ukraine and other areas in Central Europe. But this is the real key. We've imposed economic sanctions, but not on oil and gas. I mean, we have, the United States, but we import very little. Europe imports a lot. And economic sanctions cannot reverse the facts on the ground unless they're painful. And these are simply not painful enough. I mean, by some estimates, Russian GDP will contract by about 11%, but that's not enough to force Putin's hand. He's actually getting more foreign exchange today than he was before the invasion, just because the price of oil and gas have gone up, and he's still exporting a lot of it to Europe. So Europe has to wean itself off of Russian gas and oil, and the way to do this is go green, and they've already been trying, but it's going to take a while. Ironically, Germany just got rid of its last nuclear power plants, which would be one way of going green with current technology. We wouldn't have to wait for better solar technology or wind technology. The West has been sending shipments to Ukraine of defensive weapons like Stinger anti-aircraft missiles and Javelin anti-tank weapons. The Javelins have been really successful. We've sent about 7,000 or so, and they've destroyed 500 Russian tanks. Very effective. The Stinger is less so because they have a ceiling of only 4,000 meters. So they have shot down a lot of Russian helicopters, but Russian aircraft can still fly. The Ukrainians need air defense systems that can reach higher up. And some of these are being given to them by NATO allies that have Russian equipment, like the S-300 air defense missile, and like Slovakia. And so they're sending those things to Ukraine, hopefully then, in their view, to be backfilled by better U.S. equipment, like the Patriot. We need, we need to start sending so-called offensive weapons. I hate this term because tanks and artillery and aircraft can be used in a defensive role as well. But unless better armed, Ukrainians might not lose, but they cannot necessarily win, which will just extend this conflict out in time. I was on TV yesterday, and they had another guest on who was one of Putin's lackeys from Moscow, and it was just hilarious to hear this guy talk. But one of the questions they asked him is, about the negotiations, and he said, the negotiations, the Ukrainians walked away. Well, no, the Ukrainians didn't walk away. The fact is that the Russians are just asking too much. They want all this territory. They want a government that's subservient to Moscow. It's not like negotiations aren't going on. It's the two sides can't agree on a negotiated settlement, and so the fighting goes on. The fighting is a substitute for negotiations. That's how war works. This is what Karl von Clausewitz wrote in his book on war. It's negotiations by other means. So if they can't agree at the negotiating table, they fight some more, and then maybe they can come back to the negotiating table and agree. And I think the only way this ends with a settlement that the world can live with is the Ukrainians have to knock the Russians back and make the Russians fearful. And that's usually when negotiations really can become serious then, when both sides feel they have more to gain by negotiating than by continuing to fight. The wild card is, will Putin launch a nuke on Ukraine to escalate the conflict? And the West had best be thinking about what our response should be, because we can't just say, that's happening in Ukraine. Nuclear weapon is a different animal altogether. And that's all I've got, so I'd be happy to take some questions in the back.
So you referenced that the fight may go on for a long time. That's the Joint Chief of Staffs, Milley, said that a couple weeks ago, might be years. May 9th is an important date in Russia. How much credence do you give to maybe May 9th he declares victory on the eastern border and convinces his people of his victory and sells for it?
Yeah, you know, an autocrat can't lose. If autocrats lose, they lose their, you know, their mojo, if you will. And for Putin, that could lead to his ousting from power. So he's got to figure out a way to declare victory. And, you know, the way he's trying to declare victory now, I'm sorry, slides are gone. So is by taking the South.
Will you repeat the question for the people on Zoom?
It was, will Putin use May 9th VE Day as a means to declare victory and end the war? And I just think he needs something a little bit more tangible to rely on. So it'd be a nice thought, but I don't think it'll happen.
Do you think how the United States handled the withdrawal from Afghanistan, which by any measure was not good, did that give the thought to Putin to proceed?
Yeah, so the question is, our withdrawal from Afghanistan, did that empower Putin, thinking we were weak? It certainly played into his mindset, but he already thought the West wouldn't fight. So he looked on NATO as sort of an empty shell of an alliance, one that, you know, would make noises about his invasion, but wouldn't actually do anything about it. So that was just part of that mindset that he had, but I don't think it was the driver.
Yes, there are some dire predictions about the French election on what the outcome. Any truth, any fear over that?
Yeah, I think election of Marie Le Pen would be disastrous for France and for the West. The question is if she actually became Premier of France, would she actually back up her talk with concrete actions? Or now that she's in power, would she sort of become, you know, more moderate, if you will? I don't know, but that's a real wild card.
Is there a concern with the states that are not backing the trade bans, such as China, India, most of Africa, Brazil, and Mexico, and how that plays out in the
Yeah, well, the two key ones are China and India. The rest are sort of, you know, background noise. India is kind of in a conundrum because it uses Russian military equipment, so it can't afford right now to alienate its arms provider. And we just have to work with India to wean it off of Russian equipment in the future if they're willing to do that. And China, we all know, Xi and Putin had their little confab at the Olympics. And, you know, their common enemy makes them friends right now. And China is a potential market for Russian oil and gas. So there's not much we can do at the moment, but what we can do is convince China that, you know, if it were to try something like this in Taiwan, it would face even greater sanctions that would tube its economy. This is something that I think Xi has to take seriously because, you know, a Chinese economy in free fall could lead to significant popular dissent against Communist Party rule. And the last thing that they want is to take Taiwan at the expense of losing their grip on power in China. In the back, in the red.
I'm sorry if I missed this earlier. What do you think the chances are, the odds that Russia would use nuclear weapons? Because it seems like that would just change.
Yeah. So the odds of Russia using a nuclear weapon, I think are, you know, better than 25%, which is saying a lot. And they would use them, I think, in Ukraine, not again. I think even Putin's not stupid enough to use a nuke against a NATO state because that would lead to his annihilation, probably a lot of Western cities as well. But But he could use nuclear weapons on the battlefield in Ukraine to try to tip the balance there and escalate the conflict in order to force some sort of negotiated settlement. But I really think that the Western leaders have to figure out their response now, so they're not sort of fumbling around with it if that happens. And I think we would have to react, even if we react with a conventional response to assist the Ukrainians in Ukraine, to hit Soviet aircraft. Maybe we, at that point, put in a no-fly zone and a no-missile zone, and put U.S. air defense there. But we have to do something. We cannot allow a nuclear strike to go unchallenged, because that just, it changes the world in which we live.
So technically, aren't we already in World War III, except for the fact that, of course, the rest of the world is not joined in? But how long are we going to watch the murder of all the people continually throughout the Ukraine? Are we going to wait until they're totally decimated and everybody's gone, and then he's sitting at the borders of the others? Or when is it time that really we should take some form of action? It's like walking in an alley and watching 5 people being beat up and do nothing.
Yeah, so the question is, are we in World War III, and what should we do about the humanitarian suffering and the murders, war crimes that are taking place? We're not in World War III, but it's kind of a semantic term, if you will, just because the entire world is watching and is part of the sort of the social media aspect of this, the propaganda aspect. Doesn't mean that this is a world war. The fighting is confined to one area. So this is a regional war at best. In terms of when do we act, I would remind you that 500,000 Syrians died in a civil war there, and we did nothing. There have been plenty of places around the world where people have died in greater numbers than are dying in Ukraine right now, and we did nothing. So, in this case, we are doing something. We're arming the Ukrainians. The question I think that you're asking is, when do we get involved, right? So if the United States would actually put in a no-fly zone or put troops in or whatnot, we would basically be at war with Russia. And I think that would be a very dangerous place to be. I'm not sure that most Americans would decide to give up Columbus, Ohio for the Donbass, right? So this is what the president has to calculate. Now, an escalation by Russia, a true genocide, people throw that term around, but killing, war crimes do not equal genocide, right? The Russians are killing plenty of people, but they're not trying to eliminate every last Ukrainian, which is the definition of genocide. So, it's something that I think best of all worlds is we have war crimes tribunals at some point, but you have to win the war to be able to bring the criminals to justice, right? And we'll go to this side. Yeah.
What about the aircraft and our unwillingness to let them have aircraft? What is the rationale of that?
I don't think it's a good one. And it wouldn't be. The Poles wanted to give them MiG-29s, but they wanted to send them to a U.S. air base first, so that technically it would be the United States providing MiG-29s. No one wants to piss off Putin by being the one to actually give them the aircraft. I think we should give them the aircraft, right? In the Vietnam War, we were fighting with South Vietnam against North Vietnam and the Viet Cong guerrillas, and Russia was sending aircraft, tanks, and artillery to North Vietnam that we had to then battle. This would be the same thing, us sending tanks, artillery, aircraft to Ukraine that the Russians then have to battle. No difference. So I think we should do it. But I think we'll get there. I really do. In the back.
What effect do you think the war in Ukraine will have on Chinese leadership in the next several months?
Yeah, the impact of the war on China. The one thing I think is Xi is looking very carefully at the West's response, and I think he's been surprised as Putin at how united the response has been. So I think the Chinese are probably recalculating what it would take to actually take Taiwan, because this is really the only issue that that there would be a war over. Little islands in the South China Sea don't get up to that standard. So I think he's watching, and I think he's recalculating, and hopefully he sees that it's not worth the risk. Yeah.
I've always heard that Ukraine was the breadbasket of that whole area. What's the chances that they're going to plant a new crop of wheat or whatever it is their big crops in the next coming season? Because they're supplying India, they're supplying Russia.
Yeah. So Ukraine and Russia are both big suppliers of wheat to the world. But there is actually plenty of wheat. The reason that food prices are going up is the shipment of Australian wheat to the Middle East, takes 3 weeks, 4 weeks. The shipment from Odessa, from the Ukrainian port, takes 5 days, right? And so the transportation costs for the food are going up. And this is leading to price spikes in the Middle East. It's going to then lead to popular discontent and perhaps revolution. So there's going to be more violence as an outgrowth of the inability to export wheat from Russia and Ukraine to places, especially in the Middle East, that are reliant on that particular zone to provide us food. But, our farmers, Brazilian farmers, Australian farmers, they could ramp up wheat production, but the transportation costs then become higher, and as we all know, they become higher because there's less oil on the market, along with the length of the supply line. Yes.
What can we do to prevent this in the future? I mean, if something like this is going to happen again, obviously we weren't able to prevent. The Western Alliance was not able to prevent this.
Yeah, I'm not sure. The best way to prevent this in the future is to make sure Putin loses, so that a autocrat thinking about doing something like this in the future goes, might not be what I want to do. But if he actually succeeds, then I'm not sure we will be able to prevent it in the future.
Because how long are we going to keep on our, all of everything, all of these different, economic.
How long are we going to keep the sanctions on?
How long will we keep these sanctions?
Indefinitely. I think right now the Western leaders are talking about how to contain and keep these sanctions on over the long haul, because they realize this is going to be a long war.
One more question.
Okay, one more question.
Is there any chance, while it would kill him economically, that Putin turns off the spigot of natural gas to Europe?
I don't think so. Would Putin turn off the spigot? I hope he does. I really do, because his foreign exchange reserves go down. Europe will be forced to then get serious about finding substitutes, and it would hurt Russia in the long run. This is you've got to think long game here, not short game. Everyone thought, this war is going to be over in a matter of days, and then it was weeks, now it's months. I've been saying from the very beginning, this is going to be a war that's going to take years, unless Putin gives in. All right, thank you very much.
I'm just so thankful to be part of this club, to be a member with all of you guys, and to be able to do all the great things that we do. So thank you so much. I'll see you guys next week.
Thankful for you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I'll see you guys next week or Friday.